November 7th, 1943. Carpiquet Airfield, Caen, France. The brutal headwinds over the English Channel had consumed fuel at an alarming rate. Second Lieutenant William E. Roach of the 358 Fighter Squadron, 355 Fighter Group, watched his gauges drop toward empty as his Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine began to sputter. He faced an impossible choice. Ahead lay the safety of England, tantalizingly close yet impossibly far with his fuel situation. Below him stretched a patchwork of French fields, some friendly, most occupied by German forces. One airfield looked remarkably similar to the Allied bases he knew. Roach committed to his approach. The massive Republic P-47D Thunderbolt, serial number 42-22490, nicknamed Beetle, touched down smoothly on the grass field. Roach followed a ground vehicle to a parking area, shut down his engine, and only then noticed the Balkenkreuz on nearby aircraft. The Germans he had been fighting minutes earlier now surrounded his cockpit with rifles drawn. Lieutenant Roach's war as a combat pilot was over. He would spend the remainder of the conflict at Stalag Luft 1. But the education of the German Luftwaffe was about to begin in ways neither side could have anticipated. What the Germans discovered when they examined Beetle would fundamentally alter their understanding of American industrial capacity and technological sophistication. The P-47 Thunderbolt represented not just a fighter aircraft, but a complete manifestation of American engineering philosophy, production capability, and material abundance. Over the next 18 months, as German engineers methodically disassembled, tested, and flew-captured Thunderbolts, they would confront an uncomfortable truth. Germany had not simply fallen behind in the technological race. They had been competing in an entirely different category of industrial warfare. The story of captured P-47s in German hands reveals how overwhelming material superiority, when properly applied to military aviation, could render tactical excellence and pilot skill increasingly insufficient to change the war's outcome. The Thunderbolt would teach German engineers lessons they desperately needed, but ultimately could never apply. Their nation lacked the resources, the industrial infrastructure, and the time to implement what American factories produced as standard equipment. The capture of William Roach's P-47 on November 7, 1943, was not the first time the Luftwaffe had encountered the Thunderbolt in combat. German pilots had been fighting the massive American fighter since April 1943, when the 4th Fighter Group first escorted B-17 bombers into hostile airspace over occupied Europe. Initial impressions from Luftwaffe combat reports reflected a mixture of contempt and confusion. German pilots, accustomed to the nimble Fokker-Wulf FW-190 and Messerschmitt Bf-109, found the American fighter absurdly large, sluggish at low altitudes, and apparently designed by engineers who had never considered the requirements of aerial combat as the Luftwaffe understood them. Combat reports from German fighter units throughout the spring and summer of 1943 consistently noted the P-47's poor rate of climb, its ponderous handling at lower altitudes, and what they perceived as American pilot reluctance to engage in traditional turning dogfights. The initial assessment among experienced Luftwaffe pilots was that the Thunderbolt represented an inferior design that could be outmaneuvered at medium altitudes where most combat occurred. This assessment would prove catastrophically incomplete. But other details in those same combat reports hinted at something more troubling that contradicted the narrative of American inferiority. Pilots described how Thunderbolts that chose to disengage from combat could not be caught once they entered a dive. They mentioned 8 heavy machine guns that fired with devastating effect when the American pilots did choose to engage. They noted armour protection that seemed impervious to standard 7.92mm rounds and often resisted even 20mm cannon fire. Most disturbingly, they reported that even badly damaged Thunderbolts continued flying, limping back to England with battle damage that would have destroyed any German fighter. Damaged P-47s routinely returned to base missing sections of wings, with engines streaming oil, with control surfaces shot away, yet still under pilot control. When Lieutenant Roach's intact Thunderbolt rolled to a stop at Carpiquet, the Luftwaffe finally had the opportunity to examine in detail the aircraft they had been underestimating. Local Luftwaffe personnel immediately recognized the intelligence value of capturing a complete, undamaged example of the American fighter. Within hours, Beetle was surrounded by armed guards to prevent sabotage or damage. American markings were swiftly painted over with German Balkenkreuzer on wings and fuselage, and bright yellow identification paint was applied to undersurfaces and tail surfaces. This yellow paint was standard Luftwaffe practice for all captured aircraft, designated RLM-04 yellow, used to prevent friendly fire from German anti-aircraft gunners who might otherwise shoot down their own evaluation aircraft. Shortly after capture, arrangements were made to transfer the aircraft to Rechlin, the Luftwaffe's premier testing facility located approximately 100 kilometers northwest of Berlin in Mecklenburg. The aircraft received the designation T9+FK, the coding used by the Circus Rosarius evaluation unit. Hans Werner Lerche, the principal test pilot and chief engineer at Erprobungsstelle Rechlin, was assigned to conduct the initial evaluation flights. Lerche, who would ultimately fly over 125 different aircraft types during the war without ever crashing or seriously damaging a single aircraft, approached the P-47 with professional curiosity, tempered by appropriate caution given the aircraft's unfamiliar systems. His first impression, documented in his logbook and later published in his memoirs, Luftwaffe Test Pilot, Flying Captured Allied Aircraft of World War II. War II reflected surprise at the cockpit's complexity. The instrument panel contained what seemed like twice the number of gauges found in German fighters. Strange levers controlled systems Lerche had never encountered in German designs. The turbo supercharger system required understanding of exhaust flow management principles that were theoretical in German aviation circles, but apparently standard practice in American designs. The constant-speed propeller operated differently from German equivalents. Most confusing was the elaborate system of automatic engine management that German pilots handled manually through constant throttle and mixture adjustments. Lerche wrote in his memoirs, "The P-47 cockpit could baffle even an experienced pilot. I gradually managed to ascertain the function of most of the levers and instruments, but there were also some obscure controls, the meaning of which was not immediately clear to me." He spent considerable time on the ground experimenting with controls and studying the layout before attempting flight, a testament to his methodical approach to test flying unfamiliar aircraft without benefit of pilots' manuals or operational documentation. The engine start sequence alone revealed sophistication beyond standard German practice. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 Double Wasp required specific procedures to properly initialize the massive turbo supercharger system. Lerche followed the process methodically, his engineer's mind cataloguing each step and inferring the purpose of each action. When the 18-cylinder radial engine roared to life, it produced a sound utterly different from the sharp bark of German inline engines, or even the BMW 801 radial that powered the FW190. This was a deep, powerful rumble that spoke of enormous displacement and tremendous power reserves held in check. Lerche taxied carefully, feeling the weight of the aircraft through the controls. The P-47D weighed nearly 10,000 pounds empty, and this example was still carrying substantial fuel and full ammunition load, bringing it closer to 13,500 pounds. For comparison, the FW190A8, one of Germany's heaviest single-seat fighters, weighed approximately 7,650 pounds empty and roughly 10,800 pounds at maximum loaded weight. The Thunderbolt was genuinely massive for a single-seat fighter, larger than some twin-engine aircraft in Luftwaffe service. Lerche advanced the throttle for takeoff, and the difference between German and American engineering philosophy became immediately apparent. The R2800 developed 2,000 horsepower at standard boost settings, with war emergency power reaching 2,300 horsepower when using water methanol injection. Germany's BMW 801D, the finest radial engine in German production, and the power plant of the FW190, produced between 1,700 and 1,730 horsepower at maximum continuous power settings. Even with this power advantage, the P-47's greater weight meant the takeoff run was longer than Lerche expected, consuming nearly the entire grass field at the transfer airfield. But once airborne, Lerche began discovering why German pilots who had fought Thunderbolts only at low altitude had fundamentally misunderstood the aircraft's capabilities. He climbed steadily, nursing the turbo supercharger to operating temperature as altitude increased. Below 15,000 feet, the P-47 felt exactly as German combat pilots had described in their reports. Heavy, sluggish in turns, unable to match German fighters in maneuverability. The rate of climb was mediocre at best compared to the FW190 or BF109. At this altitude range, any competent German pilot in a contemporary fighter could outmaneuver the Thunderbolt in sustained turning combat. But somewhere above 20,000 feet, the character of the aircraft transformed completely. The turbo supercharger, driven by exhaust gases, and becoming increasingly efficient as air pressure decreased with altitude, began forcing massive quantities of compressed air into the engine cylinders. While German engines gasped for oxygen and lost power as altitude increased, the R2800 maintained full rated power. At 25,000 feet, where German fighters were operating at perhaps 70% of their sea-level power, the Thunderbolt's engine was still producing full-rated output. Lerche pushed the throttle forward at 25,000 feet and felt the Thunderbolt accelerate with surprising vigor for such a large aircraft. He rolled into a dive to test high-speed characteristics, and the aircraft responded with an enthusiasm that bordered on violence. The P-47 accelerated past 500 miles per hour in a steep dive, reaching speeds where the controls stiffened dramatically as airflow compressed around the airframe. At this speed, recovery from the dive required both hands on the control stick and considerable physical strength. The aircraft was approaching the limits of compressibility that would not be fully understood until the jet age. The roll rate impressed Lerche immediately and contradicted everything German pilots had assumed about the heavy American fighter. Despite its size and weight, the Thunderbolt could roll faster than any German fighter Lerche had flown, including the FW190, which was considered excellent in roll performance. This characteristic, combined with its devastating dive speed, created a tactical advantage that German pilots had been reporting without fully understanding the implications. An American pilot in trouble at high altitude could simply roll inverted and dive away at speeds no German fighter could match. Any Luftwaffe pilot attempting pursuit would encounter compressibility effects that the P-47's stronger airframe and more effective controls handled more successfully. Lerche flew the captured Thunderbolt through a comprehensive test program, exploring the flight envelope systematically according to standard Rechlin evaluation procedures. His preliminary report contained observations that troubled Luftwaffe headquarters staff, who still believed German fighter designs were fundamentally superior. At altitudes above 25,000 feet, where aerial combat was increasingly occurring as Allied bomber formations flew higher to escape German flak, the P-47 Thunderbolt was not inferior to German fighters. It was superior in specific crucial ways that negated German advantages in maneuverability and rate of climb. Over the following weeks, Rechlin's engineers subjected Beetle to exhaustive testing according to standard Erprobungsstelle procedures. They photographed every component from multiple angles. They measured every dimension with precision instruments. They weighed every major part and assembly. They tested every system under various conditions. The turbo supercharger system received special attention, as this technology represented the primary difference between American and German approaches to high-altitude performance. What they discovered in detailed examination shocked engineers accustomed to resource-constrained design philosophy. The Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp consisted of 18 cylinders arranged in 2 rows of 9 cylinders each around a central crankshaft. Total displacement measured 2,804.5 cubic inches, equivalent to 45.958 litres. For direct comparison, the BMW 801D displaced 2,560 cubic inches, or 41.8 litres. But displacement alone didn't explain the significant power difference between the engines. The R2800 incorporated forged aluminum alloy pistons, sodium-cooled exhaust valves to handle extreme temperatures, and a crankshaft forged from high-grade steel alloy that German metallurgists examined with professional envy, recognizing materials they could no longer obtain in sufficient quantities. The quality of American materials and manufacturing precision astounded the German inspection team. Every component showed evidence of precision manufacturing to tight tolerances. Surface finishes were consistently smooth across all parts. The magnetos used materials that were increasingly scarce in Germany. The spark plugs incorporated high-grade ceramics of superior quality to German equivalents. The fuel injection system operated with precision that German engineers associated with laboratory equipment rather than combat aircraft expected to function reliably under harsh conditions. Most tellingly, the entire engine showed no signs of material substitution or quality compromises forced by resource limitations. The Americans had built this engine exactly as originally designed, using all specified materials without the desperate improvisations that increasingly characterized late-war German production. The turbo supercharger system revealed engineering sophistication that Germany had attempted to develop, but never successfully implemented in production aircraft. Exhaust gases from all 18 cylinders were collected through manifolds and routed through insulated pipes running along each side of the fuselage to a turbine unit located behind and below the cockpit. This turbine, spinning at tremendous speed driven by hot exhaust gases, drove a centrifugal compressor that forced additional air into the engine's supercharger. The system included an intercooler to reduce the temperature of compressed air, thereby increasing its density and preventing destructive detonation. Automatic regulators controlled boost pressure and turbine speed without requiring constant pilot intervention beyond setting the desired manifold pressure. German engineers understood the theoretical principles perfectly. They had conducted experimental programs exploring similar approaches, but implementing such a system in mass-produced combat aircraft had proven impossible given material shortages and manufacturing limitations that plagued German industry by 1943. The turbo supercharger required exotic high-temperature alloys for turbine blades that had to withstand extreme temperatures while spinning at high speeds. The control system demanded precision manufacturing and reliable components. The extensive ducting needed heat-resistant materials and perfect seals to function efficiently. Every element had to work reliably in combat conditions, exposed to vibration, temperature extremes ranging from -60 degrees Fahrenheit at altitude to over 200 degrees near the engine, and potential battle damage. The Americans had solved all these problems and installed the complete system as standard equipment on every P-47 produced. The turbo supercharger was not experimental equipment reserved for special missions or limited production runs. It was simply how the airplane worked, installed in thousands of examples. This casual implementation of advanced technology as standard production equipment revealed an industrial capacity that German engineers found difficult to fully comprehend. German technical reports from the Rechlin evaluation noted that the turbo supercharger system alone represented a level of engineering sophistication and manufacturing capability that exceeded current German capacity to replicate in production quantities. The materials, the precision manufacturing, the quality control required to produce such systems reliably at scale simply exceeded what German industry could achieve in 1943 given strategic material shortages and the progressive degradation of manufacturing standards caused by Allied bombing and the replacement of skilled workers with forced labor. The armament installation provided another lesson in American abundance and attention to design details. The P-47D mounted 8 Browning M2 machine guns of .50 caliber, with 4 guns installed in each wing. Most German fighters of the period carried mixed armament of typically 4 machine guns and 2 20mm cannons, or in early models 6 machine guns total. The American decision to install 8 heavy machine guns represented a deliberate choice to maximize firepower even at the cost of additional weight and complexity. Each machine gun was fed from a separate ammunition box built into the wing structure, each box containing 425 rounds. Total ammunition capacity was 3,400 rounds across all 8 guns. For direct comparison, the FW-190A typically carried approximately 2,000 rounds total for its machine guns and 500 rounds total for its cannons. The P-47 pilot could fire all 8 guns continuously for approximately 20 seconds before exhausting ammunition, with the combined rate of fire approaching 100 rounds per second. When all 8 guns were properly harmonized to converge at a single point in space, the volume of fire was simply overwhelming to any target. German test firings of the captured aircraft's armament system documented the devastating effect. The installation quality impressed German armaments specialists who examined the systems. Each gun was mounted in an electrically heated bay to prevent freezing at high altitude, where temperatures could drop to -60 degrees Fahrenheit or lower. Spent cartridge cases and disintegrating belt links were collected through chutes and ejected through ports in the wing's lower surface, preventing them from damaging the aircraft or interfering with control surfaces. The system functioned flawlessly during Rechlin testing, despite firing thousands of rounds under varying atmospheric conditions, with no jamming or feeding malfunctions recorded. Ammunition quality also revealed another dimension of American industrial capability. The .50 caliber rounds used armor-piercing cores manufactured to consistent specifications, incendiary compounds that functioned reliably, and tracer elements that burned predictably. Testing revealed that American ammunition was consistently more reliable than equivalent German production, which had suffered quality degradation as strategic materials became scarce. The Thunderbolt's armor protection demonstrated American willingness to accept significant weight penalties in exchange for pilot survivability, a philosophical difference from German design priorities. The cockpit was surrounded by heavy armor plate on multiple sides. The pilot sat in what American designers called an armored bathtub that provided protection from below and from behind. The windscreen incorporated thick bulletproof glass capable of stopping machine gun rounds and resisting cannon shell fragments. Additional armor plates protected critical systems, including oil coolers and the vulnerable turbo supercharger. Total armor weight exceeded 200 pounds, roughly equivalent to the weight of adding 2 additional machine guns with ammunition. German fighters typically carried less comprehensive armor protection, prioritizing lighter weight and better performance while accepting higher pilot casualties as an unavoidable cost of combat operations. The design philosophy difference revealed itself clearly in maintenance accessibility. American designers had clearly anticipated that mechanics working in forward air bases would need to service aircraft quickly, possibly at night, possibly under adverse weather conditions, possibly while under threat of enemy attack. Every major component could be accessed through large panels secured with quick-release fasteners that required only simple tools. The massive engine could be changed in the field within a few hours, using standard hoisting equipment and following clearly documented procedures. German fighters, designed with the expectation of factory-level maintenance for major repairs, typically required more extensive disassembly for major component service. This difference reflected American abundance versus German scarcity. The Americans could afford to dedicate engineering resources to maintainability because their industrial capacity allowed them to optimize designs for operational efficiency rather than pure production efficiency. The radio installation in the captured P-47 represented another area where American technology exceeded German equivalents. The aircraft carried an SCR-274N command radio for air-to-air and air-to-ground communication, plus an SCR-515A liaison radio providing additional communication channels. Both units operated with a clarity and range that exceeded contemporary German radio capabilities. German radio systems suffered from persistent interference problems that American engineers had apparently solved through superior component design and better shielding. The radios also integrated with an identification friend or foe system that automatically identified friendly aircraft to ground controllers, preventing friendly fire incidents. This level of automated identification represented a sophistication that German forces lacked in 1943. Perhaps the most profound revelation for German engineers came not from any single advanced system, but from the cumulative impression of quality and completeness throughout the aircraft. Every component appeared to be the best possible version of that component that American engineers could design and manufacturers could produce. Nothing was obviously compromised due to material shortages. Nothing showed clear evidence of substitute materials being used because preferred materials were unavailable. Nothing reflected the desperate improvisations that increasingly characterized German late-war production as strategic bombing degraded industrial capacity and material shortages became acute. German technical reports compiled at Rechlin and distributed through the Luftwaffe technical services emphasized this point repeatedly. The P-47 Thunderbolt had been built exactly as the designers intended, using all specified materials and processes, with no apparent compromises forced by resource scarcity. This level of manufacturing fidelity to original design specifications was becoming increasingly difficult for German industry to achieve as the war progressed. The flight testing program continued through the winter of 1943 and into early 1944, as additional P-47s were captured and brought to Rechlin for comparative evaluation. On May 29, 1944, another P-47 landed in German hands when Second Lieutenant Lloyd S. Hathcock of the 301st Fighter Squadron, 332nd Fighter Group became disoriented during a ferry flight and mistakenly landed at the enemy-held Rome Littorio airfield in Italy. His aircraft, serial number 42-75971, was quickly seized by German forces. This P-47 had previously been the personal mount of George Novotny, an 8-victory ace flying with the 317th Fighter Squadron. The Germans transferred the aircraft to Rechlin, where it was initially designated 8+6, then later transferred to Circus Rosarius on October 12, 1944. Where it received the designation T9+LK. The testing data accumulated at Rechlin produced tactical recommendations that were compiled and distributed to frontline Luftwaffe fighter units. These recommendations advised that engaging P-47s below 15,000 feet offered the best probability of success for German pilots, as the Thunderbolt's poor low-altitude performance and slow rate of climb gave German fighters clear advantages in that regime. Pilots were specifically warned to avoid diving away from attacking Thunderbolts, as the American fighter would simply accelerate to speeds that German aircraft could not match in a dive. The reports emphasized that damaged P-47s frequently continued flying despite battle damage that would destroy German fighters, so attacks needed to be pressed home aggressively with concentrated fire, rather than assuming that a few hits would down the aircraft. But the tactical advice, however useful to individual pilots, could not address the fundamental strategic problem that became increasingly apparent. Germany was fighting an opponent with effectively unlimited material resources relative to German industrial capacity. Every damaged or destroyed P-47 was replaced within days from production that exceeded 300 aircraft per month at peak output. American pilot training programs produced skilled aviators in quantities Germany could no longer match as training was compressed and fuel shortages limited flight hours. The logistics system supporting American Thunderbolt operations delivered fuel, ammunition, and spare parts without apparent constraint, while German logistics deteriorated under relentless Allied air attack. The captured P-47s were eventually transferred to the Wanderzirkus Rosarius, the special Luftwaffe demonstration unit commanded by Flugkapitän Theodor Rosarius. This specialized unit traveled to frontline fighter bases throughout occupied Europe, allowing German pilots to see captured Allied aircraft firsthand and learn recognition features and combat characteristics. The demonstrations served dual purposes, both educational and psychological. Pilots learned the visual recognition features and tactical characteristics of enemy aircraft they would face in combat. But they also saw physical evidence that Allied equipment was often superior to their own in specific important capabilities, particularly at the high altitudes where combat increasingly occurred. Post-war interviews with Luftwaffe pilots who attended these demonstrations revealed the psychological impact of seeing the captured American fighters' capabilities demonstrated directly. While the Zirkus Rosarius pilots could show that German fighters maintained advantages in certain flight regimes, particularly at medium altitudes, the demonstrations made clear that at the altitudes where American bomber formations operated, escorted by P-47s and later P-51s, German fighters were at a distinct disadvantage. The intelligence gathered from captured P-47s included detailed performance data that directly contradicted some of the optimistic assumptions that had circulated in Luftwaffe briefings earlier in the war. At sea level, the P-47D achieved a maximum speed of approximately 350 miles per hour, not particularly impressive compared to the FW-190A's 408 miles per hour at the same altitude. At 10,000 feet, the Thunderbolt reached approximately 375 miles per hour, but at 30,000 feet, the P-47 achieved 426 miles per hour, while the Focke-Wulf struggled to reach 370 miles per hour, and the Bf-109G managed approximately 385 miles per hour. The performance advantage at combat altitudes was clear, decisive, and growing more important as Allied bomber formations flew higher to escape German anti-aircraft fire. The service ceiling comparison proved equally discouraging for German pilots. The P-47 Thunderbolt's service ceiling reached 42,000 feet. German fighters rarely operated effectively above 35,000 feet, and their performance degraded rapidly at higher altitudes due to reduced engine power in the thin air. American bomber formations could and did operate at altitudes where German interceptors could barely reach them, and where the interceptors that did reach combat altitude had insufficient power reserves for effective combat maneuvering. The P-47 escorts operated comfortably at these altitudes, maintaining full combat capability while German fighters struggled. Range comparisons between American and German fighters revealed another dimension of American industrial and logistical superiority. With external fuel tanks, the P-47D could escort bombers on missions penetrating deep into Germany. Early P-47 models had limited range that restricted their effectiveness, but by 1944, Thunderbolts equipped with 108-gallon drop tanks routinely flew missions covering 1,000 miles or more. German fighters, designed primarily for short-range interception missions in defense of the Reich, lacked the internal fuel capacity for extended operations. The difference in operational radius meant that American fighters could engage at times and places of their choosing, while German fighters were forced to fight defensively. The captured Thunderbolts also provided insights into American pilot training and tactical doctrine through examination of gun camera footage and analysis of combat damage patterns on aircraft that had survived combat before capture. The evidence suggested that American pilots consistently employed tactics that emphasized the P-47's strengths while avoiding situations that exposed its weaknesses. They maintained high altitude where the turbo supercharger provided clear advantage. They used dive and zoom attacks rather than attempting sustained turning dogfights where German fighters held advantage. They worked in coordinated pairs or four-ship flights rather than engaging in individual combat, maintaining mutual support, even when this meant declining apparently advantageous individual engagement opportunities. The discipline evident in American tactical execution impressed Luftwaffe analysts who studied the evidence. Many Luftwaffe pilots, particularly experienced aces, preferred to fight individually, relying on personal skill and aggressive tactics to achieve victory. American pilots appeared to follow established doctrine consistently, supporting each other systematically, and rarely allowing individual pride or aggression to override tactical sense. This disciplined approach, combined with superior high-altitude equipment and growing numerical advantage, created a combination that even veteran German pilots found increasingly difficult to overcome as the war progressed. By D-Day in June 1944, the strategic situation had deteriorated to the point where intelligence on captured aircraft provided little practical value to Germany's war effort. The Luftwaffe understood clearly that American equipment was superior in important ways. They comprehended American tactics. They had detailed technical data on Allied aircraft performance. But this knowledge could not produce the resources, strategic materials, manufacturing capacity, and trained personnel needed to effectively compete. The Rechlin reports, carefully compiled and professionally distributed throughout the Luftwaffe technical services, served primarily to document the technological and industrial gap that was driving Germany toward inevitable defeat. The comparison between American and German engine production illustrated the impossible position Germany faced. Pratt & Whitney, along with Licensee Ford Motor Company, produced over 125,000 R2800 engines by war's end. Production of this single engine type exceeded Germany's entire combat aircraft engine production. BMW produced approximately 61,000 examples of the 801 radial engine throughout the entire war. The Daimler-Benz DB605, Germany's most produced inline engine, reached approximately 42,400 units total production. American production of one advanced engine type surpassed Germany's total output of all combat aircraft engines combined. American industry in 1944 produced approximately 96,000 aircraft, while Germany reached approximately 25,000 aircraft of all types. The United States produced 38,000 fighters alone, plus 16,000 heavy bombers, plus thousands of medium bombers, transports and trainers. When combined with British and Soviet production, the Allied advantage in aircraft production exceeded 5-1 by 1944. The industrial base supporting this production operated on a scale Germany could not match. The Aluminum Company of America alone produced more aluminum than Germany's entire aluminum industry. Individual American steel plants frequently outproduced the entire Ruhr industrial region. The automotive factories that manufactured vehicles operated on moving assembly lines where German plants used batch production methods. Even the machine tools that built the machines that built the aircraft were themselves produced in quantities that allowed American industry to supply not only its own requirements, but also substantial quantities to British and Soviet allies. The captured P-47s ultimately ended their service in the chaotic final months of the European War. The aircraft, designated T-9+FK, originally William Roach's Beetle, was recovered by American forces at Göttingen in May 1945, found among a collection of captured Allied aircraft that the Germans had been evaluating. Photographs taken by American forces show the aircraft still wearing partial German markings, parked alongside FW-190s and Bf-109S in what was effectively a museum of captured equipment documenting the breadth of the Luftwaffe's intelligence-gathering effort. The Thunderbolts that served with German evaluation units provided German pilots and engineers with an education they desperately needed, but had received too late to matter strategically. The aircraft demonstrated that American industrial philosophy prioritized absolute capability over elegant efficiency, abundant resources over careful optimization, and systematic material advantage over individual technical excellence. These priorities, when implemented with nearly unlimited resources and manufacturing capacity, produced weapons systems that outclassed German equivalents in the aggregate, even when German designs showed superior characteristics in specific isolated parameters. The lesson extended far beyond the P-47 itself. Every category of captured American equipment told the same fundamental story. The B-17 Flying Fortress bomber, with its quartet of turbo-supercharged Wright Cyclone engines, represented a strategic bombing capability Germany never achieved. The P-51 Mustang, combining American airframe engineering with the British Rolls-Royce Merlin engine, created what many historians consider the finest piston engine fighter of the entire war. The P-38 Lightning, with its twin turbo-supercharged engines and tricycle landing gear, demonstrated American willingness to pursue unconventional solutions. Each aircraft type revealed the same fundamental American approach: solve problems through superior engineering supported by unlimited industrial capacity rather than through clever optimization constrained by resource scarcity. Luftwaffe analysts clearly observed that they were not being defeated by superior tactics or better-trained pilots, though American training programs were producing adequate pilots in overwhelming numbers. They were being defeated by an industrial system that could design adequate equipment and then produce it in quantities that rendered German qualitative advantages increasingly irrelevant. The Americans designed to their industrial strengths, leveraging massive manufacturing capacity, abundant raw materials, and efficient logistics. Germany, by 1943, was designing despite crippling industrial limitations, attempting to achieve through engineering cleverness what they could no longer accomplish through industrial might. The strategic implications were well documented throughout the Luftwaffe's technical services by the end of 1943. Germany had entered the war with arguably the world's most advanced air force, equipped with aircraft that were generally superior to their opponents on a one-to-one basis. German pilots were better trained than most opponents initially. German tactics were more refined, but German industry fundamentally lacked the capacity to sustain these advantages when facing opponents with vastly greater industrial resources. American aircraft production doubled repeatedly. In 1940, again in 1941, again in 1942, and continued expanding until by 1944, American factories were producing over 96,000 aircraft annually, while Germany never exceeded 40,000 aircraft in any year, despite desperate efforts to increase production. The quality gap between American and German aircraft widened steadily rather than narrowing. In 1942, German aircraft were often superior to their American opponents. By 1944, American aircraft equaled or exceeded German designs in virtually every important category. By 1945, the gap had become a chasm. American fighters like the P-51H and P-47N represented evolutionary refinement of already excellent basic designs. German fighters like the TAR-152 represented desperate attempts to extract more performance from industrial systems collapsing under the combined weight of strategic bombing, raw material shortages, and the replacement of skilled workers with poorly trained forced labour. The psychological impact on Luftwaffe morale of facing endless streams of capable enemy aircraft proved as destructive as the material losses. German pilots reported feeling less like warriors in honourable combat and more like targets in a systematic destruction campaign. No matter how many Allied aircraft they shot down, more appeared the next day. No matter how skillfully they fought, American numerical superiority eventually prevailed through sheer attrition. The knowledge that their opponent's equipment was often superior to their own, delivered in far greater quantities, supported by better logistics, and flown by adequately trained pilots who were quickly replaced when lost, created a pervasive sense of inevitable defeat that spread throughout the fighter forces during 1944. The captured P-47s served as tangible physical evidence of this reality. These were not propaganda claims or exaggerated intelligence reports. They were actual aircraft that German pilots could examine directly. The Thunderbolt was not some miracle weapon or revolutionary technological breakthrough. It was simply a very good fighter aircraft, properly designed for its mission, adequately powered, well-armed, appropriately protected, and manufactured in quantities sufficient to overwhelm opposition through systematic application of material superiority. The final historical irony was that the Germans learned these lessons thoroughly, documented them professionally, and grasped the implications completely, yet could never apply the knowledge they gained. Understanding American industrial superiority did not grant Germany the aluminum, steel, fuel, skilled labor, undamaged factories, and functioning transportation networks needed to produce equivalent aircraft in equivalent quantities. Knowing the P-47's exact capabilities did not provide the high-temperature alloys, precision manufacturing equipment, quality control systems, and trained workforce needed to build comparable turbo-supercharger systems. Intelligence gathered from captured aircraft documented the dimensions of German defeat with professional thoroughness, without offering any realistic path to avoid that defeat. When Allied forces captured Rechlin and its associated facilities in May 1945, they found extensive documentation of the captured aircraft evaluation program. German technical reports filled filing cabinets, detailing every measurable characteristic of every American and British aircraft that had been examined during the war. The reports were models of technical thoroughness and scientific objectivity. They also represented thousands of man-hours spent meticulously documenting capabilities that Germany could observe and measure but never replicate given their deteriorating industrial situation. American technical intelligence teams who reviewed the German reports after the war noted with professional interest that German engineers had understood American aircraft capabilities more clearly and in greater detail than American commanders sometimes did. The Germans had identified weaknesses in American designs that American pilots learned to work around through experience. The technical analysis was frequently more detailed and rigorous than equivalent American evaluations of their own equipment. German engineering competence had never been in question. But the American reviewers also noted what the German reports implicitly revealed about Germany's strategic situation. Germany had attempted to fight a modern industrial war with an industrial base insufficient for the task. They had compensated through excellent engineering, superior pilot training in the early war years, and tactical innovation born of necessity. These advantages had sustained them through early victories against opponents with similar resource constraints. But against an opponent like the United States, possessing industrial capacity that exceeded all other major powers combined, excellent engineering and tactical skill could only delay the inevitable outcome rather than change it. The story of German engineers examining captured P-47 Thunderbolts provides a clear case study in the realities of industrial warfare as it had evolved by the Second World War. The Thunderbolt succeeded not because it was the absolute best possible fighter aircraft by every conceivable measure, but because it was a very effective fighter aircraft produced in quantities that made isolated examples of technical superiority strategically irrelevant. American industry built 15,683 Thunderbolts, while simultaneously building 15,486 P-51 Mustangs, 10,037 P-38 Lightnings, 13,738 F-6F Hellcats, and 12,571 F-4U Corsairs. Total American fighter production exceeded 70,000 aircraft during the war, and each aircraft represented thousands of hours of skilled labor, tons of aluminum and steel, hundreds of precision components, and manufacturing capacity that Germany could not approach. The P-47 Thunderbolt became a symbol of American industrial dominance to German pilots who fought against it. Luftwaffe pilots used the same nickname American pilots had coined, calling it the Jug in acknowledgement of its ungainly appearance. They also called it Indiana, after the Thunderbird emblem many squadrons painted on engine cowlings. As losses mounted and the strategic situation deteriorated, some referred to it simply as that 8-gun fighter, and learned through bitter experience to avoid engaging Thunderbolts at altitudes where the American fighter held tactical advantage, which increasingly meant avoiding combat above 20,000 feet, where the turbo supercharger gave the P-47 decisive performance superiority. By the war's end, P-47 Thunderbolts had destroyed approximately 3,752 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, while approximately 3,499 P-47s were lost to all causes, including operational accidents, mechanical failures, and ground attack missions. This roughly 1-to-1 exchange rate in total losses appears unremarkable until one considers that Thunderbolts served primarily in the ground attack role from mid-1944 onward, facing intense anti-aircraft fire during low-level missions, rather than engaging primarily in air-to-air combat. In the pure fighter escort role during 1943 and early 1944, P-47s achieved significantly better exchange rates, particularly at high altitudes where the turbo supercharger advantage was most pronounced. The ground attack role revealed yet another dimension of American design philosophy that emphasized versatility. When P-51 Mustangs, with their superior range, began taking over bomber escort duties in 1944, the 9th Air Force reassigned many Thunderbolt groups to tactical air support missions. The rugged P-47, with its reliable air-cooled radial engine and heavy armor protection, proved exceptionally well suited for dangerous low-altitude attack missions. The same characteristics that made it seem ponderous in low-altitude dogfights — substantial size, heavy weight, comprehensive armor, powerful armament — made it nearly ideal for ground attack missions where survivability and firepower mattered more than maneuverability. Thunderbolt pilots flying ground attack missions destroyed staggering quantities of German military equipment. Official claims documented through gun camera footage and after-action reports included over 86,000 railway cars, 9,000 locomotives, 6,000 armoured fighting vehicles, and 68,000 trucks destroyed or damaged. While such claims inevitably included some duplication, the scale of destruction was undeniable and had measurable impact on German military operations. The P-47, armed with bombs and rockets in addition to its 8 machine guns, had evolved into a true multi-role combat aircraft. German ground forces learned to recognize and fear the characteristic sound of Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engines at low altitude. The deep rumble provided warning of impending attacks that German troops were largely helpless to prevent. The psychological impact of constant air attack, combined with substantial material losses and the disruption of logistics and communications, measurably degraded German ground forces' combat effectiveness throughout 1944 and 1945. The question of what happened to the specific captured aircraft provides an epilogue to this story. William Roach's P-47D Beetle, 42-22490, designated T9+FK by the Germans, survived the war and was recovered by American forces at Göttingen in May 1945. After evaluation by American intelligence teams examining German testing procedures, the aircraft was eventually scrapped. Lloyd Hathcock's P-47D, 42-75971, designated T9+LK, met a similar fate, recovered but not preserved for historical purposes. The pilots' fates after capture differed markedly. William Roach spent the remainder of the war at Stalag Luft 1 in Bath, Germany. He was liberated by Soviet forces in May 1945 and returned to the United States. Lloyd Hathcock spent 11 months as a prisoner of war, primarily at Stalag Luft 3, the site of the famous Great Escape that had occurred just 3 months before his arrival. He was the only African-American pilot among thousands of white prisoners at the camp. When Soviet forces advanced westward in January 1945, German forces evacuated the camp, forcing prisoners on a brutal winter march to Stalag 7A and then Stalag 13D. He was liberated by Allied forces in April 1945. Hathcock returned to the United States and played a significant role in the post-war desegregation of the U.S. Air Force. He later pioneered innovations in aerial reconnaissance photography at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base. Hans Werner Lerche survived the war despite flying 125 different aircraft types, including numerous captured Allied aircraft throughout the conflict. His remarkable safety record, never crashing or seriously damaging a single aircraft throughout his test pilot career, stands as unique in aviation history. After the war, he provided extensive debriefings to Allied intelligence services about German aircraft development programs. His memoirs, published in 1977 in German and translated into English in 1980, provide one of the most detailed first-hand accounts of the German captured aircraft evaluation program and offer valuable insights into how the Luftwaffe assessed Allied aviation technology. The broader lesson that emerges from the story of captured P-47 Thunderbolts in German hands transcends the specific technical details of one aircraft type. The Thunderbolt evaluation at Rechlin demonstrated that by 1943, the outcome of the air war over Europe was being determined not by pilot skill, tactical innovation, or even aircraft performance in narrow technical terms, but by industrial capacity applied at national scale. The nation that could design adequate equipment and produce it in overwhelming quantities while simultaneously producing everything else a modern military requires would inevitably defeat opponents who produced technically superior equipment in insufficient quantities. Germany's situation by late 1943 was that of a nation attempting to compete industrially against opponents whose combined industrial capacity exceeded German capacity by factors of 5 or more. When Britain refused to capitulate after France fell, when the Soviet Union survived the initial German onslaught and relocated its industry beyond German reach, and when the United States entered the war with its vast untouched industrial base, Germany's path to military victory effectively closed. The only question was how long Germany could continue fighting and how much destruction would occur before the inevitable conclusion. The story of Beetle and the other captured Thunderbolts at Rechlin thus becomes a microcosm of Germany's broader strategic dilemma. German engineers could examine American equipment, understand American capabilities, and accurately assess American industrial strength. This knowledge was professionally gathered, carefully analysed, and thoroughly documented. But knowledge alone could not produce the aluminum, steel, rubber, fuel, machine tools, skilled workers, undamaged factories, and functioning railroads required to compete with American industrial output. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, examined in minute detail by German engineers at Rechlin, proved a final truth about industrialized warfare in the 20th century. Material abundance, systematically applied through competent engineering and adequate tactical execution, would defeat technical excellence constrained by resource scarcity. The most powerful element in America's arsenal was not any individual technology, however impressive, but rather the complete industrial system that could conceive, design, develop, test, produce, and logistically support thousands of complex weapons systems simultaneously, while maintaining quality and continuously improving designs based on combat experience. The captured Thunderbolts taught this lesson with undeniable clarity. German engineers measured it precisely, documented it professionally, and reported it accurately through their chain of command. The lesson arrived too late to matter. By the time William Roach's Beetle was being meticulously examined at Rechlin in late 1943, the outcome of the war was already determined by industrial mathematics that no amount of German engineering skill or pilot courage could overcome. The Thunderbolts, sitting on German airfields wearing hasty Balkenkreuz markings over American stars, represented a future that had already arrived, one in which industrial capacity had become the decisive factor in modern warfare.